You've all seen it. Mulan stands atop a snowy mountain pass, staring down Shan Yu, a hulking, yellow-eyed warlord leading a horde of terrifying horsemen. The movie calls them the Huns. But then you stop and think, wait a second, wasn't the big bad of the Huns supposed to be called Attila? And wasn't he way over there in Europe threatening Rome? Not here in China marching on the Great Wall. Were Mulan's enemies really the same dudes who devastated the greatest empire of the West? Or is this just one of those very long games of historical telephone where multiple civilizations have blurred together into one barbaric boogeyman? To crack this mystery, we've got to go way, way back. Let's ride. Over 2,000 years ago, the Chinese had one unending nightmare from the north: nomads. They rode horses like second skins, drew deadly bows from atop the saddle, and could appear at the gates of a city before anyone had the time to light the beacons. These guys were the reason the Great Wall went up. China's first emperor didn't build that crazy wall in 220 BC to keep the world out, it was to keep them out. These guys were the Xiongnu, equestrian lords of the Eurasian steppe, and that unfinished wall would never hold off these ferocious fighters forever. By the Han Dynasty, a couple decades later, they were once again a very serious problem. Han chronicles described endless campaigns against the Xiongnu. Sometimes it was bloody wars, sometimes awkward peace treaties sealed with royal marriages, sometimes trade caravans passing through checkpoints. But the riders of the steppe were always out there, a looming assurance of uncertainty. But then, the Han Dynasty struck back in 133 BC, and they struck back hard. Their campaign culminated in the epic battle of Muobe in 119 BC, which we covered here. And with that, the great Xiongnu Confederation gradually started to crack. Some clans submitted to Han rule, others broke off and vanished westward into the endless Eurasian grasslands. For centuries, few saw them again. But then, 400 years later, a new, massive, and merciless mounted army suddenly materialized. But not in China, in Europe. To the Romans, the Huns were a menace that seemed to appear out of thin air. Writers described them as short, scarred, ruthless, bow-legged from a lifetime of horseback riding, living in tents, drinking fermented milk, eating raw meat. Their tactics? Blitzkrieg, drive-by bombardments, relentless swarming skirmishes, firing backwards in false retreats, all breaking armies before they even had to get close. At their head was Attila, the so-called Scourge of God. He forced Constantinople to pay him tribute, bullied Rome itself. For a moment, it looked like he might steamroll Europe entirely. Sound familiar? The echoes of the Xiongnu were impossible to ignore. Both buried their elites with sacrificed horses and rich grave goods. Both terrified sedentary empires. Even the names matched suspiciously well. Xiongnu, in Old Chinese, that sounded something like Hyuna or Hyuna. To Latin ears, that could easily become Hun. And modern science has tightened the case. DNA analysis from Hun graves as recent as this year show a broad mosaic of ancestries. European and Central Asian for sure, but also some notably East Asian, with a few lineages going straight back to the Xiongnu elite. Add in the archaeology, add in the tactics, and the simplest answer is the Huns were a distant westward echo of the Xiongnu. So, mystery solved, right? The Huns that Mulan fights must be the Xiongnu, renamed for Hollywood audiences. Easy! Not so fast. Just when everything seems neat and tidy, history throws a wrench in it. The Xiongnu were broken at Muobe in 119 BC. By 200 AD, they were splintered and scattered, and in China, they'd either been absorbed or were serving as frontier mercenaries. The Ballad of Mulan, Mulan wasn't created until hundreds of years later, around the 5th century AD. By that point, the Xiongnu weren't a threat anymore, and Attila, he was 5,000 miles away, either ransacking Italy or long since dead. So if not the Xiongnu, and not the Huns, then who on earth was Mulan fighting? Her story comes from the era of the Northern Wei, Bei dynasty, of the period called the Northern and Southern Dynasties, Nanbei Chao. Now who are they fighting? A confederation called the Rouran. These guys were the new top dogs of the steppe, harassing northern Wei borders, the way the Xiongnu had once harassed the Han. And who were the Rouran then? Well, besides also being hunters on horseback, they do have a genetic connection to the Mongols. So is that our answer? Was Mulan fighting Genghis Khan's great-great-great-great-granddad? Well, here's the twist within the twist. The Northern Wei weren't Han Chinese at all. They were founded by the Xianbei, another powerful steppe people who had risen after the Xiongnu collapsed. That means Mulan was likely of Xianbei heritage, making her a steppe girl in a dynasty led by steppe rulers, fighting other steppe people. But in an even more curious twist of fate, the Xianbei were actually more genetically similar to the Mongols than the Rouran were. Which is to say, Mulan wasn't fighting the Xiongnu or the Huns or really the Mongols. She herself was an ancient ancestor of the Mongols, fighting her other proto-Mongolic cousins. Crazy, right? But how does this whole lineage actually trickle down to Genghis Khan then? Well, to answer that question, we have to crawl even deeper into the rabbit hole. You see, a long time ago, the steppe was home to a large confederation of nomads the Chinese called the Donghu, literally Eastern Hu. Now, Hu was a catch-all word for barbarian nomads. But the Donghu were distinct, more Eastern in appearance, linguistically closer to what we'd call Mongolic. Back in 150 BC, the Xiongnu smashed the Donghu, but the Donghu didn't disappear. They split into branches. One became the Xianbei and one the Rouran. And after the Xiongnu were ousted, they all came back on the scene with the Northern Wei dynasty in 386 AD. Then after the Xianbei fell, came the Khitan, Qidan, who got seriously beaten down by none other than Mu Guiying in around the 10th century AD in this video up here. They would then fracture and be absorbed by the Jurchen, Nuzhen, in Manchuria, who later would rebrand themselves as the Manchu, Manzu, defeat the Ming dynasty at the epic Battle of Sarhu in 1619, which I tell the story of up here, and eventually rule China as the Qing dynasty. The tale of those big confederations only tells us the story of the Northeast. You see, all the while, there were still clans roving on the Mongolian grasslands. Some coalesced from fallen confederacies, some scattered by past conquests, some left behind long ago by the Xianbei. On their own, they were all inconsequential, but they shared the same echoes of the old Donghu, the same ancestral heritage, the same nomadic culture, the same mastery of the horse, just less of the fame and none of the fortune. And that was about to change. Among these clans, there was a man named Temujin. Although he sometimes claimed the legacy of the Xiongnu and the Xianbei, in reality, he wasn't the direct heir to either of them. What he was the heir of the entire eastern steppe, of the centuries of riders who lived and died in the saddle. And when he rose, he wove all of those legacies into one banner and united all of those clans into one empire, the Mongol Empire. And so Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan, came from nowhere and everywhere. Not the heir of one lineage, but the culmination of all of them. He was the climactic chord of a song that had been building up for 1,000 years, not defined by any one genetic melody, but the harmonies of similar cultures intertwining across millennia. So, was Disney completely wrong? Yes. But with a history this complicated, you can't entirely blame a cartoon for fudging the details. What is true is that Mulan's ballad takes place in that same grand story of the steppe. Her little frontier war encapsulates a 1,000-year epic connecting the past and the future. Behind her, the ghosts of the Xiongnu and the Huns. Before her, the shadow of Genghis Khan. And if there's anything to be learned from these scenes of history, it's that where you come from doesn't have to define who you are now. And where you come from is no limitation to who you can become. So, with these famous figures in mind, like, subscribe, become a member, and break through your own glass ceilings. Until next time, 再见!